right, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing? I've done a few events here as we're restarting our events, in-person events, but they've been in the afternoon and they have a bar in the back. And the problem has been everybody's in the back, but I'm glad to see everybody's up front here. So good morning and thank you for coming to the chamber this morning. Let me just start off with a few remarks. Look, capital markets exist to provide an exchange. It allows businesses to enter the markets to acquire the resources they need to start and operate and grow, while investors provide the capital hoping to achieve a return. There's no guarantee of success, but material information is critical for actors on both sides to make informed decisions. Here in the United States, we have the most fully developed capital markets globally. And over the past 25 years, our markets have experienced a tremendous increase in transparency. This has improved price discovery and dramatically reduced costs that have benefited individual investors. It's against that backdrop that the Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed a swing pricing and hard close provisions of the open-end fund and liquidity risk management proposal. Try saying that 5 times fast. Since the release of the proposal in November, we've been worried about the impacts of the proposal on millions of Americans who invest in mutual funds. The proposal to mandate swing pricing, a new fee on top of the net asset value, kicks in if there are redemptions of any size or net purchase in excess of 2% and requires a 4 p.m. hard close for fund transactions. In reviewing this proposal, we became concerned that swing pricing could upend mutual funds and how investors use them. Frankly, we also found the SEC's cost-benefit analysis more than wanting. Accordingly, we commissioned HXH to research these issues, and their analysis is jarring. We're releasing that report this morning. A combination of swing pricing and a 4 p.m. hard close could erode total retirement assets by an average of $32 billion a year. Implementation costs to funds and plan sponsors could erode retirement plan assets by an additional $10 billion a year. While the SEC basically didn't look at the impacts of this proposal on the marketplace itself, the costs are even more astounding when you start to look at it piece by piece. And our report only looks at mutual funds. We do not look at the 55% of the market that is made up of IRAs, 529 plans, 457 plans, annuities. But let me put this, let's take the billions out of this and let's look at this and what this actually means for an individual investor. If you take a set it and forget it investor who makes an initial investment of $25,000, they could lose up to $50,000 in additional costs over a 26-year period. $50,000 to an individual investor is real money. So first off, I'd like to thank HXH for their work on this report. I'd like to thank Bill Holst for his leadership of the CCMC team, Kristen Malanconico for being our leader in all things asset management, for Ashley Eisner and the entire chamber team for putting this event together. I'm now excited to start this event with a fireside discussion with SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, who has served as a commissioner since January of 2018. As you all know, Commissioner Peirce has knowledge on many issues under consideration by the SEC, given her previous experience at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where she conducted research on the regulation of financial markets, and as senior counsel on the Senate Banking Committee, where she advised Ranking Member Shelby and other members of the Committee on Securities Issues. So, Hester, why don't we come on up? As I was getting ready for this event, I was thinking, I think the first time you and I met, and I think it was with Mike Pivovar, I think it was either late in 2008 or early of 2009 on fair value accounting and financial crisis issues, whatever. And I was struck by the fact that I think many of the issues we've talked about over the years are actually coming back. So
sadly, that's true. Well, thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks to the Chamber for hosting this event. It's quite gratifying to me, actually, that there's a room full of people who want to talk about this, because I I remember when we proposed this rule, I really thought that there would be some sort of cataclysmic response from people, that people would just be up in arms immediately. And I was sort of surprised that people were pretty calm about a rule that I thought was potentially so problematic. But so it's nice to see that people have actually gone and done some research to try to quantify what the effects will be. I think it's really useful to us to be able to look at that, so I appreciate it. I have to give you my disclaimer, which is my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. And I would have, I love this title, the SEC's swing pricing proposals, a strikeout for investors. If I had thought of that, I would have used that myself.
You've done a pretty good job with your titles, with your speeches, so that we'll take that as a high compliment.
And then the only other thing is that, it is true that Mike Pivovar, he and I shared an office, and he's an economist. He went on to become a commissioner at the SEC, but I used to always have an economist with me, and these days that would be really useful. So,
Well, so when this proposal came out last year, you equated this proposal to an essay on Greek tragedy. And I guess the question, I mean, look, anytime you look at a proposal, it's like, okay, what's the problem here that we're trying to solve? But I think this one for us, at least, has been a real head scratcher of what is the problem. So from your vantage point, what's the problem the SEC is trying to get at here?
well, I do think that there is an intent to solve a problem. I don't think we've done a very good job really putting numbers around that problem, but the problem is that it's the concern that redeeming shareholders are going to leave remaining shareholders at a deficit because they redeemed. And so, looking at what happened in March 2020, unexpected events affected all the market, including funds, right? Open-end funds, including bond funds specifically. And so I think there were concerns that trying to figure out a way to ahead of time solve the problem of redeeming shareholders, basically leaving the fund worse off. Now, that said, we've had funds for quite a while, and we did look at these kind of issues after the market timing events, and came to the conclusion that it didn't make sense to do something along these lines. So this is a new look at it, and I think it's a lot of the pressure is coming from our fellow regulators at the Fed, and the banking the Fed specifically, I think, has been focused a lot on money market funds, but I think that they've expanded that look to open-end funds, and so the Fed and FSOC, I think, have put pressure on the SEC to try to solve these problems. I fear what that ends up doing is trying to turn money market funds into banks, and now trying to turn open-end funds into banks. So I'm quite concerned about this view that you have to take all risk out of the system, which is obviously not how capital markets work. I understand the desire to stop bad things from happening, but our markets are really designed to be heterogeneous so that different types of vehicles will react differently in times of stress. And I don't want everything to just look exactly the same. I think that will be problematic in times of stress.
So with that, right, what are the concerns that you have of what the proposal means for investors?
Well, I think you mentioned some of them starting out, right, which is that this could have a really concrete effect on retirements. So that's certainly a concern. I think there are a whole range of problems. One is that it's going to mean that different investors are being treated differently, in effect, depending on where you live, depending on how you hold your investments. Same-day liquidity, getting liquidity at that day's price is something that people expect with mutual funds. And so it will really be a game changer in the way people think about their funds. Something that was just kind of easy to do, redeeming, will now be sort of a fraught exercise. And what I worry about is we're always trying to get more people to invest in our capital markets. It's it's certainly beneficial for them. And so anything that you do to make it more complicated, to upend distribution systems that have worked well, it runs the risk of running people out of that market altogether and running people out of mutual funds altogether. And I think it's important for us to think too about who are the people investing in mutual funds. I mean, there are ETFs, right? For people who are concerned about this problem, an ETF solves the problem that we're trying to solve. So, but there is a subset of the population that really does prefer mutual funds, as evidenced by their choices so far. And so I think you end up disadvantaging probably the people who most need to be in investments in mutual funds.
So, old things becoming new again, and obviously we're talking about cost benefit analysis with this too, right? And I guess, the issue is, as we talked about, because I do think you're right, we've been having a bit of a 15-year conversation about, money market funds and, risk issues and the like, and trying to deal with that. But with the report here, we found, as I, mentioned in my opening remarks, of, $32 billion in erosion and retirement accounts, $10 billion in costs, the $50,000 impact. What are your impressions of those dollars and cents impacts on retirement accounts versus the potential benefits? How do you view this?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the difficulties with our analysis, because there's a theoretical issue, and I think it's a theoretical issue that people have recognized for a while. You can end up in a situation where the people who redeem are getting redeemed out of more liquid assets, leaving the less liquid assets in a fund, and that could then people who come to redeem later could end up posing a problem for the fund, right? So you can see the theoretical problem that exists, but we haven't put parameters around the problem. And so because we haven't really done the work to figure out how big this problem is, or to specify the types of funds for which we think the problem is particularly big, it's really hard to measure the cost that you highlighted against the benefit that we're purportedly going to get. And I think that's a problem, because why would you want to adopt a rule that has greater costs than benefits? So I think it's really helpful to get concrete numbers. I'm sure our economists will look at the study and make their assessment of whether they think that it was, they'll look at the assumptions made and give their own assessment of it. But at least it gives us some concrete numbers on costs. And then I hope they can match that with some concrete numbers on benefits. But it really has been sort of this theoretical exercise, an academic exercise, which is what a lot of our rulemakings are now. It makes sense sort of when you think about it at a high level, but then you say, well, if this is really so problematic, why have these mutual funds been perceived to be such a success and served so many people so well for so long? Why hasn't everyone just fled for ETFs if this is really a problem?
Well, and then that's an interesting point, right? Because at the heart, right, at its heart, the SEC is a disclosure agency, right, to provide investors with that information. But really, in terms of investment choices, the marketplace is really supposed to make that decision, right? It's supposed to be a marketplace. So I guess the question is, do you see, as we quantified with the costs and all, and potential impacts on mutual funds, right, without getting into all the other parts of the marketplace, does this rule have the potential to start to favor some products over others? So is the SEC unintentionally impacting the marketplace?
Well, I'm sure it will favor some products over others. It'll favor some investors in some products over investors in other products. So certainly, and yes, I mean, I think you're pointing to something which we've wandered a little way away from at the SEC. We are a disclosure regulator. I think it's really important for us to make sure that products are being described to people who are buying them carefully and clearly, but then allow people to make a decision to buy them. We have certainly, and this isn't new to this SEC, but over the years, we've used our disclosure power to effectively engage in merit regulation. I think this is a more dramatic example of it. I don't know that as I said, I think the support for the rule is born of concern around systemic risk and around investor protection. So I don't want to ascribe bad motives, but yes, it could have the effect of really affecting certain products and making them less likely to be used. So that is a form of merit regulation.
So you think we've crossed that line? Because I know Chairman Gensler, I think, was testifying last month or a couple months ago, and he talked about, right, that, SEC regulations need to be merit neutral, which I think we would all agree with. But have we crossed that line that we're,
I certainly think that we've crossed the line into merit regulation. I can give you lots of examples of that. We don't like crypto, so we tell people you shouldn't invest in crypto. We don't like certain kinds of investment products that people have come in and the rules don't say anything about them not being able to offer those products, but we put conditions on them that we don't have authority to put on those products, and we do that through the back door of our disclosure process. Again, the intentions are good, but I don't think that we have the authority to do that. So certainly we do engage in merit regulation. On something like this, I think there are questions about whether we have the authority to put a rule like this into place. Commenters have raised that issue. It's one that I think we need to spend some time thinking about. But I think you can also argue against it just on the basis that you're trying to argue against it, which is just to say, all right, let's just sit down and think about the problem you're trying to solve and whether this solution is going to be worse than the problem. And I think that's where we really can win the conversation, is by really focusing on that.
I don't want to get into an international debate, but I do want to highlight one thing, in that in the U.S. we have the most developed financial markets, right? And when you actually look at our financial system, we're 80% non-bank, 20% bank. Europe, it's the exact opposite. And ironically, 8, 9, 10 years ago, when the United Kingdom was still in the EU, they were actually calling us over when they were thinking about the Capital Markets Union, of how we use our non-bank financial system, right, to fuel our economy. And once the UK left, that sort of went by the wayside. The reason why I raise that is swing pricing is a tool that the Europeans have used, excuse me, that now we're looking at imposing here, even though we have markets that are mirror images of each other, right? So is this the right tool to maybe get at some of the issues that people have been looking at? Or should we be looking at other tools, if any at all?
Yeah, and I think it's important that you bring up Europe and the international context, because I think that's another piece of this. So I mentioned, the Fed has its concerns, FSOC has its concerns, and then there's a lot of discussion in international organizations, the FSB, IOSCO, and other places. And I think that also is driving this focus on non-bank financial institutions, including open-end funds. And so there's pressure coming internationally for us to do things. And this is always the point I make. Wait a minute, our capital markets work really well. We have really high participation by American households in our markets in products like mutual funds, and they're participating directly in those products. We don't want to change that. We certainly don't want to become a more bank-dependent market, because there's an ability, a flexibility that comes with the non-bank financial institutions that can take more risk, that are much more nimble, that can disappear when they fail and not be a problem, right? And so we want to make sure that we retain that. Swing pricing is something that's been used in Europe. The distribution mechanism is quite different in Europe, and so I think that one of the concerns that I have about this rule, as it would be applied here in the U.S., is that the distribution mechanism would create operational real operational problems if we tried to impose something like swing pricing. And I think that is something, if we're looking at the European experience, we have to make sure that we're taking that into account. We also, funds here could use, since 2016, they've been able to use swing pricing. It's not really been an option that people have run out to avail themselves of. Now, the counter to that is, look, you need to make these major operational changes across the whole system before anyone will take advantage of swing pricing. You have to do something like the hard close. And that may be true, but I think I haven't heard a lot of people coming in and clamoring and saying, Hester, please make these operational changes, put in a hard close so that we can put swing pricing in for our fund.
Well, and I want to, maybe drill down that a little bit more and, go back to something that you alluded to. So obviously, SEC is a very aggressive agenda. You've got, close to 60 proposals, and I don't know how you all deal with having to read all the comment letters. I know it's tough enough to write them, but, having to read all of them has got to be something. But on this proposal, there's actually been widespread opposition. And I know even the Consumer Federation of America noted that swing pricing coupled with a hard close, can't be operationalized without significant collateral damage to open-ended market funds and investors. So I guess the question is, with that, were you surprised with that level of opposition? I think there have been 4 separate congressional letters that have been bipartisan, bicameral, raising questions about this proposal as well. So from your point of view, when you start to see Congress jumping in on a bipartisan basis, where you start to see like the Chamber and the Consumer Federation of America and ICI all sort of, saying many of the same things, what does it mean to you as a commissioner? And do you think that the SEC is actually taking this feedback into account?
Well, it's certainly, as I said, when we put the rule out, I really expected to get a deluge of negative comments. And so to some extent, this just kind of is the realization of that expectation that people would really be concerned. And I think it speaks to the fact that these funds are so important in ordinary Americans' portfolios that people who have vastly different views on lots of issues can all see that the end result could be hurting the very people that we're purporting to help. And so it is, I think, very useful to us to hear that feedback. There have been a few people who have been positive about the proposals. And so I think that's, that's relevant too. We consider all the comment letters. But yes, I mean, our staff takes the comment letters very seriously. They work very hard to work through all the issues that people raise. And so I'm sure that you'll see those comment letters affecting the final rule. I think we saw that recently on the money market fund rule, which we just adopted last week, and did not include a swing pricing element, though that had been something that was proposed. Although I have to say, one thing that I found particularly strange about this open-end fund proposal is that came out at the end of last year, and that was after the money market fund proposal had come out and after we had heard so much negative commentary on swing pricing, and we still included a swing pricing element. It seemed very odd to me because I think you could make more of a case for swing pricing in money market funds than you could in open-end funds. So I didn't understand why the initial negative commentary on our first foray into swing pricing didn't affect the second. But in any event, yes, the comments will have an effect. I hope that means that we'll really think carefully about even whether we need to move forward with this rule. There's another element of the rule that also raises concerns. So I would argue we really need to be much more precise about what the problem is and how big it is and which funds it affects before we move forward with the rule.
So I want to pick up on a couple threads in your answer there. So one is with last week's money market fund rule, as you noted, swing pricing was taken out. Now, I would also argue there are a whole bunch of other things with that rule. We could probably have a separate discussion on that itself. But does the elimination of swing pricing from the money market fund rule, does that signal anything here?
Well, I mean, as I say, I thought I don't know because it didn't when we got the initial negative commentary after the money market fund rule, we still put it in the open-end fund rule. So I don't know whether that means that we're sort of thinking about those two things differently. I think it's really too early to tell. Obviously, as you mentioned, there's a lot of commentary that says this is going to be really problematic, and we do take comments into consideration. So I'm hopeful that we'll take a moment and really think before we move forward with something that's going to have such broad effects.
So, the other threat is there are other issues besides swing pricing in this proposal as well, right? So, there are a number of different amendments to liquidity risk management rules back in 2016 that were finalized in 2018. And, there were some requirements around less liquid funds and how to regulate them and the like. So are there other concerns that you have with this proposal that could result in lower investor returns as well?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think I'm not a real fan of liquidity bucketing anyway, but I think having funds should be thinking about liquidity risk. I mean, I don't think they need us to tell them to do that, but a lot of people have seemed to like the fact that we require that people have liquidity risk management programs, but officially require that. So fine. But the changes that we're proposing to make to the liquidity risk bucketing, I think is something that commenters have really pointed to and said, what this could do is actually prevent certain people from accessing certain types of strategies and certain types of assets through the mutual fund wrapper, and that could through the open-end mutual fund wrapper. So what that could end up doing is it could end up keeping those strategies out of certain investors' portfolios, and that could certainly have consequences on their retirement returns. So I think we really need to rethink that. Some commenters have done some interesting analyses of what would this actually look like in practice, what kinds of securities would be affected and would be in this in various buckets. So that's going to require some work on our part.
So I just want to warn the audience, in about 5 minutes, we're going to turn to you for questions. So, get some questions ready, and we've got some people out there with microphones. Two last questions from me. One is, you talked very eloquently just a few minutes ago about the lack of authority. And we've also had Congress right past Secure 2.0. And there are some who look at this that, this proposal could actually be in conflict with Secure 2.0. So obviously the authority issue is one issue, right, in terms of, the major questions doctrine and the impacts there. But how do you also now, or how should the SEC look at possibly moving forward on a proposal that can conflict with congressional intent with Secure 2.0?
Well, I mean, I'm someone who thinks that we ought to listen to Congress when they tell us to do something, even when it's something I don't like. I mean, I think Congress is directly accountable to people, and so to the American people have direct authority and with respect to their Congress people, and so we ought to take directives from them seriously. So again, I'm sure all of this context is something that we'll consider as we move to final. The problem is, as you said, we've got a lot on our agenda, and there's a lot of pressure to try to get stuff done quickly. So I hope that things like that don't get lost in the mix.
And then just to maybe goes, full circle, when you made your statement when the proposal was released last year, you also highlighted that, yes, we've been having this discussion about, risk and resilience and the like. But you also talked a lot about, well, the marketplace itself provides resiliency, right? And the consumer, if you give them the investor, if you give them the information, you know what, they're going to make rational decisions, and that in and of itself is going to make the system more resilient. So are you also viewing this as, you know, sometimes you just don't need a rule either? You know, you should just let the marketplace act.
Yeah, well, one concern that I have about the direction the SEC is taking now is Chair Gensler is he talks a lot now about systemic risk and about the SEC sort of playing a role in solving systemic risk. And I have taken a different view of that. I actually don't think we have a systemic risk mandate, and I think there's a reason for that. The capital markets, if they're functioning properly, which is people are able to make choices based on good information that the SEC plays an important role in getting for them, that is itself a way to combat systemic risk, because you have different people making different decisions based on their own needs and based on their own ideas about what's happening in the market. And so maintaining the ability for there to be this heterogeneity is really important to me. And instead, the trend that we're on now is definitely a mandate trend where we are telling different bodies how they have to react so that they prevent or help to mitigate systemic risk. And what I've observed is that when the government tries to set these mandates ahead of time and tries to drive capital in particular directions or tries to drive everyone to use the same mitigating tools, it ends up causing problems that it didn't anticipate. So I certainly think that allowing markets to operate is actually the best way to build resilient markets. You need to take away any expectation that the government is going to come in when there are problems. And I think that, you know, that's the situation we've seen. We see something like March 2020 where the Fed comes in and it does all kinds of things. And then we all point back to that and say, see, the market didn't work. Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe if we had let the market play out a little, and again, I'm not trying to be critical of the Fed and actions that they took in March 2020 or in 2008, but I think that the problem is that you can't tell me the counterfactual that we didn't allow to play out and make decisions based on the fact that there would have been this massive failure when I don't know that that's actually true.
And the reality is, right, when you're taking a look at a mandated approach like this and you're trying to deal with risk in one area, the reality is you're just going to transfer the risk somewhere else, and you may not even realize that until it's too late.
No, I think that's certainly true. And I think there's also another point, which is that the operational complexities of putting something like this into effect, we could create problems ourselves in the process. It's not a guarantee that a transition of the kind that we're asking for here would go smoothly. And so, you know, that also, while that might be temporary, that also has to be borne in mind that we could really end up causing massive problems that we didn't expect. And some of that is flowing from the fact that we're trying to do everything so quickly too, in terms of implementation periods. Why not, you know, give people the time they need? If we're going to do these kinds of things, we need to make sure we're giving people enough time to make the changes.
Great. Well, with that, let's see if there are any questions from the floor. I know this is not a shy audience, so please raise your hand. Question right there.
Hey, Tom, and hi, Commissioner. Great to see you again. Stephen Bradford from ICI. Commissioner, you mentioned that last week the final rule that was adopted on money funds moved away from a swing price towards a mandatory fee, liquidity fee on redemptions. Some of us are worried that that could be a model that the chair goes down with the open-end fund ruling, and to the extent that you're comfortable prognosticating, do you think that a mandatory liquidity fee would be workable for open-end funds, or is that something that you would see issues with?
Well, I think if you're going to do something, I mean, this was my concern around the mandatory, well, I had a lot of concerns around the mandatory liquidity fee for money market funds. But one of them was that how you design a fee like that really matters, and we designed it basically with no input. It was the kind of thing where people had responded to our question saying, well, yeah, if you're going to do, if we have a choice between swing pricing and mandatory liquidity fee, we'll take the latter. But then, we designed it in a way that was, I don't know if it'll work or not. And so, yes, I mean, potentially we could end up with something similar in the open-end fund space. Again, I really don't like one-size-fits-all mandates like this. I think I would like to give funds the ability to design mechanisms that they think will work for their particular type of fund. But for us to try to do that centrally and set up one kind of fee that will work for everyone, I would be quite concerned that I wouldn't know how to design that well. So I don't know whether that's something that Chair Gensler is thinking about, but I would beware of rules where we put out a rule that everyone thinks is completely unworkable, and then we come out with an adoption where it's, moderately unworkable, and then everyone's really grateful to the SEC for being so reasonable. I mean, I would argue it's the standard that you should hold us to is a higher standard than that. We, as regulator of the capital markets, have an obligation to set sensible rules. We have our investor protection mandate, which is a very important mandate, but part of that is being deliberate and being, willing to take incremental steps. We could have done that on the money market fund rule, see how the changes, getting rid of some of the problematic rules that we had in place around gating, and then putting in these higher liquidity numbers. You could have done that and then seen how that worked out before going and adding a liquidity fee. I mean, in other areas too, we can be incremental. We don't have to do everything at once. That's the beauty of having years ahead of us to regulate. We can see how things work, and then we can make adjustments.
So half a loaf of moldy bread can be just as bad as a loaf of moldy bread.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I really think one of the nice things in some of the comment letters that I've seen lately is that there's a little bit less of this, oh, we're so grateful for the opportunity to comment. We're so honored to be, heard by such an august regulator as the SEC. I would really rather have people just cut to the chase. Line number 1, this is a terrible rule proposal, and here's why, and explain why. I mean, if you love it, tell me that too, but I think we really need to stop. This is a conversation, and it's a conversation that will only work if we're really candid with each other. If you tell me stuff is not workable and it actually is workable, that's not helpful to me. If you tell me where the real problems are, that's helpful, because then to the extent that I'm able to shift proposals, I will work on shifting them away from the things that are particularly problematic. But yes, be candid with us. When a rule comes out, it's a final rule, it's better than the proposal. You can say, great, we're glad that it doesn't have swing pricing, the money market fund doesn't have swing pricing in it anymore. But it still is really problematic, and it's still really problematic because you didn't even bother to consult with us in designing this new feature that you put in, or because you didn't listen to us and you raised the daily and weekly liquidity levels higher than anyone thought was necessary, or whatever it is. I mean, you might disagree with me on those points, but we need to be candid with each other.
Question right there.
Commissioner, I'm very grateful to hear you say that. I'm Tim Rouse. I'm the executive director of the Spark Institute. We represent the retirement industry, and we have dialogue consistently all the time with the Department of Labor, Treasury, IRS, and others. And I've yet to ever have a conversation with the SEC, but it's good to hear you say that, because we would love to have a dialogue when it comes to these issues, because they have very serious ramifications for our members.
Well, please come in and talk to us. I mean, it really is important that we hear from people for whom this is going to be problematic. So please do knock on our doors, come in. Everyone, it's not only my door is always open, but I know my colleagues, my fellow commissioners feel the same way. And I know that they all care very much about the experience of retail investors for whom the difference of a good rule and a bad rule could be really consequential, as you pointed out. So please come talk to us.
Just, and one other thing I just want to ask too, something you said earlier is that, and I agree with you, it should be a candid conversation, right, between commenters and the commission and the like too. But also, I think we, as commenters also should really take into account, if the SEC suddenly jumps to a solution that wasn't part of the record, right, or that wasn't out there for comment. So there's a logical outgrowth issue that we should also be paying attention to and coming back to the commission if there's a problem there too, right?
Yeah, I mean, rulemaking is difficult, and it's actually a real pain to write a good rule because, you put this rule out there and you say, okay, well, maybe we're not going to do swing pricing, but maybe we'll do we have these other options. And so you can build out other alternatives and you can build them out to different levels of detail. But the problem is if, we put out this idea, well, we might do a liquidity fee, but we really didn't provide detail around that to really offer people a chance to weigh in. And because there are 15 different alternatives in the proposal, people really don't know, well, should we be spending a lot of time reacting to this, or should we instead react to another piece? And so I think sometimes the answer for us has to be we have to go back to the drawing board. We could have done that so easily on the money market fund rule because we had a piece that we got pretty widespread, yes, you should adopt this piece of it. We could have done that piece of it and gone back out for comment on the liquidity fee piece of it. It wouldn't, this, as we all know, and as you said at the beginning, some of these topics have been ones we've been talking about for decades now. And so it's okay if it takes you another year before you have that in place. And I think we have cut off, this kind of a conversation is really helpful. I'm looking for, I hope I can stay for at least some of the panel following this because it's really helpful for me to hear this kind of discussion. We don't do this kind of thing at the SEC anymore. We don't sit down and bring people in and say, let's have a conversation about this particular issue. We think there's a problem here. We think that there's this problem that we need to solve. Let's talk about whether you all think there really is a problem. If so, what the best solutions are. We don't really do as much of that anymore, and I think that's really not healthy. And so, yes, sometimes trying to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act is really, it's just annoying and difficult, but you need to hold us to account because that is what distinguishes us from other places where they don't take the input of people seriously and where there are dictates that are coming from on high without any sort of grassroots participation. That can't be the right result, and that will not get us the best rules.
Yep. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Well, with that, Hester, I know we're bumping up against time, but you've got an open mic. So are there any last thoughts on anything that you would like to raise with this group here?
Well, I always have a lot of thoughts on lots of things, but I think really the same theme, which is we've got a lot of rules out there now. We're trying to do a lot, and I think it is really important for people to make the point consistently that this is not really the best way to do things. You do not need to flood everyone's inboxes with new rules every week if you really want a good result. And so I think it is important for people to be raising that point. It's certainly, from my perspective, I really value the ability to work with my colleagues at the SEC to really think through difficult problems and solve those problems. We have issues that we need to be solving. They're not even on our agenda, issues around capital formation, for example. So it's important for people to continue to say, hey, wait a minute, SEC, we know you can do better. We have higher expectations of you. So that's consistent with the theme, but I continue to underscore that.
We'll try and come out of our shell and maybe say some of those things. If that's okay.
I know that's hard for you, Tom, but
Well, Commissioner, thank you very much, and thank you
Thank
for
you all
being
very
so
much.
generous with your time. Thank you.